Perfect. All right, I'm going to pick up where we left off, but this vision that we have through our strategic plan under the area of educator support is really about using all the levers we have as a state. And a reminder, those levers are licensure, our program approval, and sharing outcomes, which currently is from our teacher prep report card, and focusing our teacher prep providers, our EPPs, educator prep providers, on outcome measures. And we truly do that through three specific areas: those evidence-based approval and annual reports that we have, our performance assessments for licensure, and finally that report card. And so as we think about setting the vision is around those three areas, and certainly the implementation then is left up to our specific higher ed providers and our alternative licensure providers to determine how are they going to meet those outcomes best. Although, I mean, you've just heard today, and I think y'all brought it up in the last session, we do need to make sure that we have our educators who are being educated, our future educators through our providers, understanding the standards, understanding assessment, and understanding that alignment. And so there are opportunities to also be more thoughtful in how we present that information to them and train our partners that are in our higher ed programs. So this has been our theory of action: to set rigorous standards and clear expectations for our educator prep providers. That's what EPP stands for, educator prep providers. Provide them with flexibility to design and implement those high quality programs. Collect and analyze data on their outcomes, and inform key stakeholders about what we found so that those folks can make data-driven decisions to help strengthen these programs and partnerships. We believe that this ultimately leads to, and this is really important, very important, that it leads to a high quality and respected teaching profession. That we're all looking at high standards for all of us, not just K-12, but everyone who's being prepared to be a teacher. They're meeting high standards. Our programs are meeting high standards. And we have data that's informing our decisions about how we prepare our educators. Ultimately, with what we're working toward in K-12, this leads to this high quality and respected teaching profession. So this is what's already happened, and you have been part of this. And so I wanted to remind you, back in October of 2014, the board adopted a new educator preparation policy that really sought to ensure that all of our approved providers actually meet these rigorous standards through these standards that were established under CAPE. You will remember that in CAPE, the National Council on Accrediting Teacher Ed has now changed to CAPE, and CAPE will help guide our program approval process as well as the Tennessee specific criteria that we will have. And I am just going to keep going if that's okay. Okay. Also, in terms of what you adopted back in October of 2014, we had something called an Implementation Working Group, another acronym, an IWG, that was created to help us with the EPP policy. So the IWG, as part of the EPP, has been working diligently over the last year to truly create some implementation guidelines around that policy that was created in 2014. They have been advising us on how this should be implemented with our partners, and I'm excited to say we have two members of that IWG here today. He will be sharing the work with you. So what does this all mean? This means, in terms of how we are thinking about program approval, that our EPPs must now meet these more rigorous standards. So that's in place. You have done that as a state board. It also means that we will have these new reports that will be coming out annually that will report on outcomes. And those outcomes will look at recruitment and selection, placement and retention, completer, meaning people who complete the program, as well as employer satisfaction through surveys, and these completer outcomes and impact, which we already see in some form on the report card. So the policy you've already passed is doing all of that. We're in that implementation phase right now, and I'll actually have Amy note how our programs are moving through that right now as we implement this work. Secondly, our educator licensure policy. So that was program approval. Remember, another lever is licensure. You as a board, back in July of 2014, also adopted the new educator licensure policy. It went into effect on September 1st of 2015, so it just went into effect. And what that meant for us is that for folks who are going through an initial licensure program, they can actually demonstrate their content competency, based on not only a praxis test, which the vast majority of folks use for entry into teacher prep, but also they can use a major in a field. So an example that Amy and I were talking about earlier is if a student who's entering your initial licensure candidate is quite frankly an adult who's been out in the workplace and they have a degree in Spanish, and we need more Spanish teachers, by the way, they have that degree, then they can use that degree for entry into teacher prep to show their content competence. So that was changed under this policy. So not just praxis, but that content would also qualify to show their competency. Secondly, licensure renewal. So we now have a streamlined process that allows educators who consistently meet or exceed expectations to use that as their renewal option. And I believe March 1, folks will start, so it's very new. March 1, we will see how many people take advantage of that option where they can show they met or exceeded expectations and they use that for renewal as opposed to all these PD credits in the past. So there's options in how they can renew. Again, that's work that you have done in 2014, and it's in that implementation stage right now. The report card, that's that third lever. So the lever of the report card is about showing outcomes and making those outcomes more public. So when we talk about a report card, our teacher prep report card, in 2007, there was legislation around ensuring that we have a report card that actually is based on outcomes of how our students who leave a teacher prep program do with their students when they enter into the field. The components that have been part of the teacher prep report card are threefold. One, on the report card, you see placement and retention rates. So how well does UT place their graduates? How well are they retained? And that retention data is primarily in public schools in Tennessee because that's what we can follow. Praxis 2 scores are also noted, as well as teacher effect data, TVOS data, based on all of the grades and subject areas where we would have TVOS data available, and you have enough candidates to have a larger N count to actually run TVOS. Subsequently, the report has grown since 2007 over the last several years based on a variety of factors. It's grown to include more demographic data, so we know the demographics of the folks that these institutions are serving, as well as trend data on effectiveness. So now that that report card's been in place multiple years, you can say, last year their candidates were effective in that area, the year before they weren't, what happened, and you can see trend data from year to year. And so that's what we've done, and that means for us that we have this great public opportunity to share how these institutions are doing on a variety of factors, as well as our groups that actually provide alternative licensure. So moving forward, I keep clicking like there's something up there, sorry. So moving forward, let me share some next steps, and then I'm going to turn it over to Amy Wooten and a couple of our folks from higher ed. We know that the area of licensure is an area where we need to continue to work, and we're going to be coming to you very soon with a few new items. One, we must implement T-Encompass, which is what I would consider our new educator data management tool to make sure that we have a seamless process online, so all of this works very effectively for our candidates. Second, we are going to need to change some of our required assessments for licensure. You heard a little bit about this in a previous meeting. We know that we need to potentially consider new cut scores for certain assessments, and we will be proposing some new cut scores to you, as well as we are considering requiring a performance assessment for all of our teacher candidates. You may have heard of something called EdTPA, which is used by our TVR institutions and most of our public institutions in Tennessee. We will be considering with our IWG moving toward a requirement of a performance assessment for all institutions, and we will be coming back to the board with those recommendations. In program approval, we are doing lots of things through the IWG to determine what are the metrics that will be used for those program approval reports, and I'm going to let them share that in a moment. And I'm excited to say the report card has now moved to the state board in collaboration with the State Department. And for the first time back on December 1, I believe I have the date right, December 1 of this past year, the state board actually produced that report card for the first time, again in collaboration with the department. And so we have a lot of opportunity going forward to make that report card actually contain what all of us believe are the right metrics to share back with teacher preparation as well as the public. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn this over to Amy Wooten, who truly serves as our point person in the department for all things teacher prep. And she has two individuals with her who I will let you come up and introduce those to us. But I wanted you to have the context, and while they're coming up, I'll be happy, I think, to answer questions if anybody has one. Okay. Oh, I get music.
Yeah, you can.
Awesome.
Music.
I love it.
2, 6, 5, 2, 9, 7.
Sorry about this. There we go. Look at that.
I want to remind our board members, you do have these slides, so if we have any more ongoing issues, we'll blow up on your sizes. Apologies again for working through it. Thank you.
So we are really excited today to have two members of our implementation working group. As you heard the commissioner say, we've been working together for about a year. And I'm going to let them tell you about our process and the composition of the group. But I just want to tell you that our team has been just incredibly impressed with the level of commitment and engagement of the people who've been on this working group. They're clearly invested in this because of what they do, but they really truly have committed a lot of time, effort, and energy to this work, and so we're very thankful to them. So instead of having someone like me tell you about what they've accomplished, I thought it would be much more appropriate to let them share that information. And so we have two folks with us today, Ms. Sheila Reddick, who is the Director of Talent Management for Shelby County Schools, as well as Dr. Jennifer Nelson, who is the Associate Director of Teacher Education at the University of Memphis. And we asked these two ladies in particular to join us today because one of the, I think, most beneficial things that's come out of the implementation working group has been the opportunity for our district folks to have this conversation along with our preparation providers and make sure that we're developing a common vision among our stakeholders in the state as we move forward to continue to improve our educator preparation. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to them, and away we go. Okay. You can pin it or hold it, whichever you prefer.
Thank you, Amy. On behalf of all the implementation working group members across Tennessee, we thank you very much for this opportunity to talk with you today. Thank you. Sheila Reddick and I were asked to come to speak about the implementation working group and about what we're doing across Tennessee, as well as share a little bit of information about how Sheila and I, or Shelby County Schools and the University of Memphis, are sharing part of this work.
Actually, I'm going to skip the slide because we've already kind of gone over the history just to show the timeline of implementation of program approval in Tennessee. And you can see this is the makeup of all of the EPPs across the state, and they vary geographically and, of course, by size. But the working group is working on behalf of all types of EPPs across the state. The current provider approval status is that we have about 60% are NCATE accredited, and then about 36% are state approved, so that's where we are today. And now we're going to talk about our projected timeline. So we got together in February, I believe, last year for the first time, and we've met, I believe, about 3 times since then. Our last meeting was actually last week in Jackson, Tennessee. And we anticipate that we're going to meet at least 2 more times in person before we come with some final recommendations in the fall. Our implementation working group is it is a cross-functional. It's truly a diverse group of folks getting together. We have EPPs, both from the UT group, from TBR, and independents. We have classroom teachers. We have folks like me who work in the central office. We have principals that have also joined the group, and then some TDOE representatives as well. And we're from all across the state. Now we're going to dig in actually on the standards, and I'll let Jennifer talk first about standards 1 and 2.
So, as it was discussed earlier, the implementation working group uses the CAPE standards as a foundation for which we work. So our implementation working group is divided up into 3 teams, and the first team is we work on standards 1 and 5, and the group has accomplished so far the standardization tool that programs can align with the NTAS standards. The recommendation to require performance assessment, as was mentioned earlier, as a component of the Tennessee Approved Educator Preparation Program, as well as development of components of a quality assurance system for program review. The next team is standards 2 and 3, and if you want to talk about that one.
So this is actually the group that Jennifer and I have been working on together, and so this one's very near and dear to us because it's really all about partnerships between EPPs and LEAs. So first I'll just talk to you about some of the artifacts that we've produced and some of the recommendations. First is a draft standardized partnership agreement that we can use to formalize state-recognized and primary partnerships. That's a big, a new term, I think. Primary partnership is when, for instance, the University of Memphis and Shelby County will have a primary partnership because we're a large district and they are our largest provider of teacher candidates. And so we'll be working together to talk about what that relationship is going to look like moving forward. And we now have a document that can help guide how that will look. We've also agreed that Tennessee providers will report on progress toward meeting needs-based recruitment goals. And that looks very different because what we're saying as districts is we're now going to be able to share what we need with our primary partners. So as you all know, Shelby County Schools, we are in an urban setting. We have urban needs that are different from suburban or rural needs. And so we can start to talk about what we need for our teachers to be successful, and then U of M and other primary partners can respond to that. We also agreed that Tennessee providers will report on progress toward meeting goals related to diversity, both in terms of candidates and types of clinical experiences. And that's similar. We know that one area that we as a district need to improve on, for example, is that we need more Hispanic teachers. We do pretty well in other areas of diversity, but that's a place where we can work with our partners to get more recruitment of Hispanic teachers. And I do want to pause a bit because we did want to take some time right here to talk about our partnership and first to note like how valuable the working group has been just even in our work today, even though we're making recommendations kind of for the future, like it's already changing the conversations that we're having between one another. We've had some very frank conversations. We've been very honest with one another about what the pain points are for LEAs, what the pain points are for the EPPs, and we've really kind of had to hash that out. And that's been a really good, I think we've developed a lot of trust and come to some understandings about each other and where we're coming from and what our needs are. I think the second thing is that, before we got on the implementation working group, Jennifer and I had been working together around some data sharing because we knew this was coming. We knew that it was really important that we as a district were doing what we could do to support teachers coming from these programs, but also starting to think about sort of a cycle of continuous improvement. So, for example, we started sharing data about 2 years ago where we sat down and we said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you shared your data on your teachers so that we can make better informed recruitment and selection decisions? And in exchange, once they come and work for us, we're going to start sharing data with you about how they're doing. That's going to then tell you about program improvements you might want to make in your EPP. So already we were having those conversations, and I think that what this working group is going to do is formalize that in a very concrete way. So we're really excited about that, and we were able to share that with, I remember the conference call when we were, when our group was talking about this, and we told that story, and everyone said, oh, that's a great idea, we want to do that too. And so some of this stuff is already working, but this is really going to formalize it and make it, happen across the state. I don't know if you have anything to add to the partnership.
Oh, just one other thing that we were talking about that came out of the implementation working group with us. Shelby County Schools came to us with a need. Obviously, we all have high areas of need, and Shelby County came to us and said, we really need math. we really need special ed teachers. And so a group of us got together and talked about how we could provide those needs based on their school system. So we really sat down and worked together about designing a program that could produce highly effective teachers for their school system with an urban focus. And so that's really a lot of, with this implementation working group, what has come out of it. So there have been a lot of very, very positive things. The third, team is the group that works on Standard 4 and the annual report. And this group has developed definitions for the cohorts and calculations on the admission standards, the placement, retention, and the Praxis 2 pass rates. And also, this team has also agreed on the presentation of TVOS data and streamlining completer and employer surveys at the state level. So as you can tell, from the various meetings that we've had, we've really been working hard and have accomplished a lot. And as we continue on, we look forward to making more movements. And that concludes our presentation, and we will open it up to questions.
On this last page, admission standards, you got GPA, ACT, what are the admission standards?
So I'll take that question. So the admission standards are actually embedded in our policy, and there's a minimum GPA requirement of 2.75, and the ACT minimum is 21. I think SAT is 1040, but I might be wrong about that. So the standards that they're setting are not those. What they are setting is rather how we look at the University of Memphis and look at their cohort of admitted candidates and say, what was your average GPA? And so CAPE has established that every cohort should have an average GPA of 3.0. So even if we have an admission standard for an individual of 2.75, the quality of the cohort, not quality, but the average of the cohort GPA should be 3.0. So how in Tennessee do we want to report this on a report card? And that's what this group is tackling right now.
So, when you're looking at a 3-point average of the cohort, you can have folks up here at 3.8, folks down here at 2.2, and they're all going through the teacher training program, because the average would be 3, right?
Well, technically, they should all have a 2.75 minimum GPA.
So the question on that is it a 2.75 at the time they're admitted into the teacher program, or at the time they enter half college?
So it varies depending on the type of candidate, and I'm not sure, I don't want to try to quote it off the top of my head, but for example, I know that for post-baccalaureate candidates, there are two ways, there are two options. You can either have a 2.75 overall GPA for college, or you can have a 3.0 in the last 60 credits of college. For our undergraduates, I just can't quote it off the top of my head. It's at the point of admission. That varies depending on the structure of the program. So some programs admit students to teacher prep much earlier than other programs do. So that varies across our providers.
And we're able to assure that over 44 teacher prep programs.
So it's reported on the report card, and as a part of that, they are expected to report to us for every completer that they have the GPAs of those completers. And there are 3 different GPAs I believe they report. One is their overall GPA upon completion, one is their admission GPA, and there's another one that I'm forgetting at the moment.
Okay.
Any other questions for these ladies?
So,
Any additional questions?
Sarah, I have a question. Will recommend requirement for a performance assessment, GPE, PGA, what is that a recommendation to us?
it sounds like it's a forthcoming recommendation. We've talked at the board level a lot about the TPA and other sort of performance-like assessments, in lieu of the ELT,
Principles of learning and teaching.
Which is basically an online test of a teacher's pedagogy. You know, ideally, you would be testing pedagogy in a performance assessment. We've needed, I think, to see the performance assessments play out there nationally in terms of how those would be scalable and sustainable on the cost front. But I think we're at a place now where we could look at a recommendation at the board level and say, yeah, there's enough research and sort of infrastructure, for lack of a better term, to require that of all of our candidates. If we, again, it's a recommendation, it would come to the board, you would determine whether or not that was the direction you wanted to go. I do think too that given our technology glitches, there were a couple slides that the commissioner wasn't able to hit, that at some point here, we wanna make sure we get back. There's one in particular with some timeline slides that I think you guys are probably gonna wanna talk about.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Amy, Jennifer, Sheila, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman, is it okay to go back briefly to the one, at least one
Okay.
slide from, or is there more that you have? Now I'm out of.
I have the next, I've got a policy recommendation that's
Gotcha.
completely
Okay, sorry.
separate,
I think I was-
so we can go back. But it doesn't appear to be working. Am I using the wrong thing?
No, you were right, it's going.
Oh.
There you go.
Is it this one that you want? Sure. So we wanted to make sure that we shared with you our timeline and anticipated major milestones. I know that I've had some conversations with board staff, and we all know that we want to move with a sense of urgency and purpose, but this is really important work, and I think I said to the commissioner earlier that we're trying to approach this in a really responsible way with a lot of buy-in that's really gonna have some traction and meaning with our stakeholders. So as was mentioned earlier, a lot of our foundational work has been done, and that was the revision of our preparation policy last fall. And so we wanted to just preview some of the things that were coming up. In the first half of 2016, we will be bringing you recommendations related to required assessment for licensure candidates. So you'll see some changes that were mentioned earlier, some increased cut scores, and things like that on some of those praxis exams that I've shared with you before, where we have really high pass rates and cut scores that are below the nationally recommended cut score. In the fall, our implementation working group will have wrapped up their work, and will bring to you a cohesive set of concrete plans for the implementation of that educator preparation policy. So if you look at that policy now, for example, there is not a metric related to placement. It just simply says we will measure placement. And the work that this group is doing is to really define carefully how placement will be measured. Moving forward, then, we will begin to implement those new standards, the CAPE standards, as well as produce our annual reports and report cards that are in line with the new metrics as quickly as we can. We are also working on revising our leader licensure policy, and hope that you'll see a first version of that in the fall of 2016. As a big component of this, we're also doing a lot of work to analyze our own data, and that's a really important component for us to understand the production patterns and district hiring needs. Because of some of the changes that we're making related to our data systems like T-Encompass that was mentioned earlier, we're going to be able to provide both our district and our preparation providers with more data about how our supply and demand look in Tennessee, in addition to our quality of the supply that we do generate. Spring of 2017 will begin requiring the use of the annual report data to help inform EPP reviewer decisions. I'll stop and talk there for just a moment, and I want to give an example about why this is maybe feels slower than it needs to be. So one of the areas that is on our report card will be completer and employer satisfaction. Currently, all of our educator preparation programs use different surveys. to gather this information. So the implementation working group has been working on designing a standardized statewide assessment for this purpose. We will then have to figure out how we deploy it, and we'll need to look at some baseline data before we would be able to begin to hold programs accountable for those types of results. But that work is in progress and is moving as quickly as we can. So that's why it says we'll begin using that data. So placement and retention and those things will be available to us much earlier than some of the other aspects. We also have some opportunity to develop what we're calling our EPP portal. We're really thrilled about this. It's a portal, an online way for us to review our educator preparation providers, and I think that this gets to Mike's point from earlier about the quality of the data that we have on our preparation providers, and this will enable us to feel that we've got much higher quality data, as well as the timeliness of our data will likely be improved. So then that's why we say a fully developed and operational educator preparation policy by 2019, because that's when we hope that all of these components will be fully built and operational. And as a result of that, by the end of 2019, we also hope that as a part of our research work that goes on with this, we'll know a lot more about those characteristics of preparation programs that in fact lead to highly effective educators.
So, this is what I mentioned earlier in the day. We've got, our dilemma is we have benchmarks going to the next, till 2000. And we're gonna be, in all of those, we're gonna hit ACT benchmarks, we're gonna be in dead middle of the country in rankings. If teachers in leadership are as far as getting there, then, and we are doing this in teacher preparation in order to prepare these people differently, in order to make those, the two timelines don't line up. So somewhere we have to figure out, because when I look at this, I'm thinking if I'm a teacher prep program, I'm gonna be saying, all right, actually, starting in 19, there'll be data collected that will start to build a record as to how successful we are or not. But even if it starts at 17 and the data is there at 19, we've got 4 classes of students going into teacher ed programs that we just might pass a licensure thing that they can't pass. We gotta figure out a way to make 2 timetables, because it involves a lot of kids. We gotta make 2 timetables a whole lot more compatible, in my opinion.
Let me first mention that I don't want, based on this timeline, for you to assume that programs don't already have data and aren't already working on rigorous standards. So there is, I can speak to this from being in my program, that we use the data from the teacher prep report card to make changes. So there's data that we've gotten that I would consider more objective data from these outcome measures since 2007, since that was instituted, and it's continued to get better in terms of the data that we've gotten every single year. In fact, I'd say the last 2 years, it's been really helpful to actually be able to dig into that data and make program change based on the further analysis that's being done, further analytics. So remember that that's already improving year by year, because we've had better data now for 5 to 7 years than we've ever had, again, in terms of outcomes. Also, educator prep programs have surveys. They're doing surveys and they're getting information back that they're using to make changes. And those have become more robust based on changes in national accreditation over the last several years. So I don't want the timeline to somehow indicate that there are a lot of these things that are already happening and in progress based on outcome data, survey data that folks already have. This is ratcheting it up to the next level, because we have new national standards, right? We have new program approval standards, new licensure standards that we're moving forward. I don't think that answered your question, but the timeline in our mind is the timeline based on how this has to be implemented in terms of what's been passed, what do we now have to do in terms of program approval, how does that impact licensure, and how do all of these things fit together?
So then, under the new national standards, which I'm certain, this has, it seems that there's gonna be some number of the 44 schools not measuring up to that new standard. We're gonna see them in here in front of us quickly.
Would you like to talk about that timeline?
So currently, yes. So the way that program approval works is on a 7-year cycle. And we have a slate of providers that are scheduled to go through the review process. They do it like semesters in school. So there's a fall slate and a spring slate every year. In addition to that, I think that our new policy gives us an opportunity to intervene if there is an annual report, and on that annual report, the data indicates that the program is struggling. The policy gives us the authority to take action before that 7-year cycle closes. Again, I think that I want to reiterate what the commissioner was saying. We have data. It's not that we don't have data that we're going to be looking at every single year. It's about making sure that we improve the quality of the data that we're looking at. So we can use the report cards and annual reports and begin to bring forward concerns that we might have about providers or individual programs that they have.
Yes, and let me put an exclamation point on that. So when you have an annual report and there is a concern, we can make lots of decisions. You can say, well, we're so concerned about these outcome measures and that they're not improving, or they look very poor, or your entry data, looks really bad on who you're actually admitting. But we can say you can't admit candidates in school.
Right.
So that could be one potential. And those happen based on these annual reports that are forthcoming. These are in process.
You're going to see that today, actually. We're bringing some leader prep program recommendations to you where there are going to be some consequences. So it's not that we don't have any options today. It's just saying that we're working toward a system that we think is going to, I love this saying, ratcheting up to the very next level, because we believe that this is so important.
This is related. You mentioned the cut scores on the praxis tests and coming back to us. I know Mike and I were both the two vocal people about the fact that we need those to be at least to the national minimum. Can you tell us, just this timeline made me think, is that this April recommendation?
That was fantastic.
You don't have to say anything else. Just be quiet.
So is that the April recommendation?
Is somebody logged into the live stream?
I did.
Still is.
So I'm not prepared today to give you details about exactly what our recommendations are going to be, but we are going to bring recommendations in April, specifically related to praxis scores.
Okay, and that would be like the first reading, and then we'd have to do a second reading?
That is correct. That's my understanding, and I looked to Sarah and the board staff for that.
So that would be April, then July.
And generally, we have to give a lag timeline. That's how it's happened in the past.
A lag time between the two readings, or a lag time after
No,
the next?
after the reading, we say beginning the next summer. That's how it's been done in the past. The board could certainly take a different action if they want to.
And so my question is, that lag time that you generally give, I guess it sounds like a year,
Mhm.
another year's worth of people below the national average, I'm just gonna say that one more time.
Mhm.
Is that in policy, or is there some reason we can't change that lag time?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that candidates know right now, they are being told by their programs, this is the score you're gonna need to get. And so what will happen if we don't do lag time? It will be a lot of candidates who get really unhappy both with their providers and with, I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it, it's just that you're a senior in college and you think that this is the expectation, and then the expectation is changed, what to them will feel like suddenly and without warning.
And I appreciate that, but where my head is you're
I-
a third grader and
Hey,
you're serving.
I am with you. I'm with you. I'm just telling you what I think will happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, we delved in this, in the fall, but as I understand the Praxis math test, it is a math test. And it covers all the different, it has questions on it from all different courses. And that will be, out of that comes a cut score, which is something less than 100. And if someone is able, when someone meets or exceeds that cut score, then they not only would get a license, but an endorsement in math, in the math courses.
With some caveats to that.
And
You either have to have completed a preparation program or be enrolled in one. If you're enrolled in one,
yeah.
you know, all that stuff. But
All right, so the other way would be a major in math. All right, here it's, and this is really my heartburn in a nutshell. In my mind, based on my knowledge of what I just explained, someone could meet the cut score in math and not have a clue about calculus, and yet would hold an endorsement in calculus. Could have got to that cut score through, geometry, you know, you can get there, but be allowed in a class by a district, a principal that's got his back up to the wall and desperate. And that's a nightmare. Same with the same stuff with the sciences. And so the other piece is, what if they major in it? So my question is, number one, there's a big difference between some of our universities and some of our other universities. An A in one may be a C in the other, but even if you're at a college that maybe not so rigorous, you could graduate with a major in math with a 2-point average. I'm not sure that's a competency level that is going to allow a lot of, particularly for the upper levels of math. So somehow or another, in my mind, there needs to be some way to determine if that person is knowledgeable as well as skilled and functional in that course, whether it's chemistry, physics, whatever, to actually teach it. They're about to get evaluated.
If I could just insert, and then you all keep going, I think, again, an ongoing conversation with Mike, you know, again, this idea of content competency and how are we assessing, content expertise, you know, whether it's the Praxis 2 or the major, and even the law that was passed several years ago that now for any teacher of an end-of-course assessment, or a subject that has an end-of-course assessment has to be fully certified, requires you to take the Praxis 2, maybe clarifying, again, where we are with what teachers have to pass, what sort of content requirements, versus where we need to go, and what are some of the things between now and April that we might look at in terms of our cut score levels, especially in those core academic areas. Does that make sense?
Yes, I would just like to speak to math because I've led many Praxis math sessions on getting folks prepared for that. And the math exams and most of the science are very rigorous. We have a shortage of people able to pass those. And I have worked with many a competence ones we're gonna bring to you, which are the ones that I think have been flagged in the past, are the ones that we feel like the content of it could be improved, and the cut score is potentially too low to show full mastery of that subject area, and you know the ones we're talking about, and, we wanna bring those to you soon. But we feel like most of these core subject areas, and if we had a concern, we would bring it, are very rigorous. I don't know how you would have to have a pretty high level knowledge of most of our math subject areas, particularly calculus, to be able to do well on these math tests.
So if you're able, because in my mind, I was thinking that Praxis would include everything from whatever math, what I used to call it, the algebra 1, algebra 2, geometry, trig, da. By the time you get to calculus, it's pretty darn hard.
And there are calculus questions on it.
So in my mind, I was thinking that there would be candidates who would do okay and adequately enough in the more easier courses to hit the cut score, but not have demonstrated necessarily those questions in there that were calculus related. And if we could extract those and figure out which ones they knew, which one they, and then give them their endorsement based on that. But somehow or another, to take a broad math exam and extrapolate from that you really are confident in some, well, I keep using calculus, it's just hard for me to, unless the cut score is 100.
What we would like to do is just share, and we will prepare something that shares around some of these particular tests. What's the percentage of questions on each, and how the test is designed to get to what that actual score is. That might be of value, because it does give some enlightenment to, there's a fairly good percentage of calculus questions on some of these math questions, and it would be challenging to do as well as you think if you didn't have some mastery of calculus on that test. But we're happy to share that information, maybe at an independent meeting.
Yeah.
That'd be helpful.
I think that is, I mean, I see what Mike's saying, and maybe just more information to understand if there is an issue there, to the point you're raising. Because then I think there are, also worth noting, different math practice too, exams, depending on what you would be endorsed to teach. So for instance, I know when I was working with Amy, we were looking at the middle school math endorsement versus an upper grades secondary endorsement, and those are different math tests.
And ETS is in the standard setting process for what they're calling an Algebra 1 Praxis exam.
So part of the ongoing question is, are we as a state using what we think are the right content assessments? Where do we think we don't have the content assessments that we might need, if at all? What does that mean in terms of any additional?
God, I apologize. Honestly, don't mean to be argumentative. But it really raises the question that if Praxis believes that having an Algebra 1 specific exam is important, then it seems logical that an Algebra 2, trigonometry, all the others would have the same import.
So that's,
An argument for one is an argument for all of them.
so that was actually something that we discussed with them, was a modular exam that would allow educators to test into certain portions. I haven't had a follow-up conversation with them to see why that hasn't happened, and perhaps it's something they're still considering.
Okay, Mindy?
I just wanted to quickly go back to the cut score and the April meeting and this lag time thing. It's like a term I hate in this world, this lag time, what it signifies to me. Is it possible to now give notice to the EPPs that you are looking at the cut scores and that you're looking at raising cut scores that are below the national averages, so that those students, that they can have an obligation to tell their students this may be coming? Just throwing that out there, because when we get to that second reading and we start talking about a lag time, I'm gonna have a problem with it. So I'm gonna try to be respectful to the students, but also not
Sure.
another year with kids with teachers
Sure.
in the classroom that aren't at the minimum nationally.
I think that it would be a question about whether you really want us to preempt your action. And the only second thing I'll say, and I am philosophically very probably aligned with your thinking, so I want to say that for my personal self. But I do think that it presents a communications challenge for us, and it would be concerning to me that there would be mixed messages out there. Because what we can do when it's been made, when the decision has been made, is, you know, be very clear about what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. If we say this, if we start doing things like this might happen and then it doesn't happen, we can get a lot of confusion. I don't know. Maybe there's a world in which we can do it on a first and final reading.
Well, let's not go there yet, but I think what we can do is work together on some communications, because I think what I do hear and know to probably be true is that moving forward, we're as a board always gonna be looking for that national recommended cut at a minimum.
Oh, yeah.
So being clear about that, and then the question is whether or not, how long the transition to that new cut score would be, how it's been done in the past, what we might be looking at as board moving forward. So I think, let's talk, let's see what we can do, that, I don't wanna be wishy-washy or unclear in any communications, but I also think we can sort of take the sentiments and sort of work together on what might make sense there.
Yeah, and I would add, as you know, someone who used to have to implement that when this changed, that you do have to have some phase in. You can think differently about it being a year, but there would have to be a phase in based on where that student was in the program. And so I think that's where we can go back to the drawing board and say, okay, based on this person is, you know, one course away and they're taking the practice exam and they're about to student teach, you could phase that in slightly differently than saying it's a year for everybody. So I think we could think through that, and that might actually help the matter where it feels faster. And it would be faster, quite frankly, for most candidates.
Okay. Anything? Yeah, I think, you know, obviously, the board has felt for some time and been fairly passionate about a feeling that we don't have as rigorous standards as we need to have in this area. And I think we've done some things. We have increased in cut scores. We're further down the line in doing what we're talking about than we were, you know, 3 or 4 years ago. But I think we still feel that we've been too timid in bringing all the recommendations that we need to have, and I think we've been particularly timid about the phase-in period, just how long it's taken. So I think we need to figure out how we can be more aggressive. And, you know, just the bottom line, when you look at the total infrastructure we've got out there, it's 44 schools and so forth, you know, we just have to believe that we've got some opportunities to improve the quality of the product. We've got to be more aggressive, be a little bit more rigorous in what we're expecting. Okay. Mike, you happy?
I'm worn out.
Okay. Let's, Amy, you have
I would go right to happy with Mike.
Yeah.
Care if I'm happy?
Please don't go.
So now I get to present revisions to the educator preparation policy. So as has been noted, you all approved a new educator preparation policy in October 2014. And since that time, a few issues have come up that have made it clear to us that we just needed some additional clarity in our policy, and in one case, a little bit of additional flexibility. First, I'm going to talk about out-of-state preparation providers and how they are eligible to work with candidates who are seeking Tennessee licensure, and then about prospective providers who want to start new programs in Tennessee. So I'm gonna move quickly because I think we're probably very far behind. So I'm gonna skip this slide. Oh, this is terrible. You can't see it. So first of all, the approval of out-of-state providers. Here I am going to go to this. Sorry, I know it's hard to see. So first of all, out-of-state providers that are approved in another state have always been and are still eligible to recommend candidates for licensure. So if somebody completes at the University of Arkansas and they are an approved program in Arkansas, they can recommend them for licensure in Tennessee, and that's not changing. What is changing is that the way that out-of-state providers are allowed to work with candidates who are preparing within Tennessee. And so I'll give you an example. Harding University works in Shelby County, and that's a really great partnership, and it's something we don't want to put an end to. But we do require that they be approved in their home state. And then in addition to that, they can't support a candidate who's doing a job-embedded clinical practice, which means they're teacher of record while they're enrolled in that program, unless there is an explicit partnership on file with the department. In addition to that, we're stating here that out-of-state providers should not be advertising as Tennessee-approved providers. Just because you're allowed to enter into a partnership agreement doesn't mean that you've been through Tennessee's approval process. So Harding is another example. They don't do this. They don't say that they are a Tennessee-approved provider. They say they are an Arkansas-approved provider. But that did come up, and it was something we felt that we needed to say. Out-of-state providers, who we also wanted to be very clear with our out-of-state providers that if they do in fact produce enough completers to meet our counts on any of the metrics that we use for our annual reports and report cards, that we would produce a report card on them and their candidates. We will of course invite them to share with us any other data that we collect from our providers. Another issue that has come up is an out-of-state provider that wishes to become a Tennessee-approved provider. And so we wanted just to make sure that our policy was clear on this. So first of all, you have to meet all requirements for state approval just like any other provider would. Secondly, you would need to identify Tennessee program candidates and completers. And what that means is there's federal Title II reporting, and you have to be able to know if someone's enrolled, whether they're enrolled with the intention of becoming a Tennessee teacher. And that's kind of really, really detailed, but I can explain that more if you're interested. They need to have a clear presence in Tennessee. We do feel strongly that it's important that if they're going to be working with educators who are training in Tennessee classrooms, that they need to be present in our state in some way. So if a candidate's having a problem, they're not sort of left floating on their own with no way for that provider to come in and see and work with them in their classroom. Set goals of producing at least 10 candidates per academic year. The reason we do this is to say you've got to seriously want to be in our world in order for us to do all the work it's going to take to do to make you an approved provider. And we think that 10 candidates per academic year is actually not that rigorous for someone who's seeking to be a Tennessee approved provider. Finally, demonstrate capacity to provide effective mentoring and supervision. And have selection criteria that meet or exceeds the Tennessee minimum expectations. And then once approved, they will be subject to all of our review procedures. So I'm going to keep moving. We also have found that we have new providers that are interested in becoming Tennessee approved. They're in Tennessee, but they did not have an established track record. The current policy stipulates that a new provider, this is just moving too quickly. And I left my folder over there. So a new provider currently would have to submit 3 years of clean audits in order as a part of their initial application. And so that really thank you, Martin, that really put a barrier in front of a provider that had not been established for at least 3 years. And because we know that there are a lot of innovative approaches to preparation that are very interesting and that we might like to consider, and we feel we have a rigorous review for our initial providers, we wanted to think about ways that we could allow them to demonstrate financial stability that would protect our candidates, but would allow us to consider these innovative approaches. So the requirement may be met by submitting financial information verifying the prospective EPP has the ability to refund candidates who might have paid tuition, or refund districts that might have paid them for a recruitment fee or something of that sort. And one way to do this would be through a surety bond or something like that, which we have used in the past related to textbooks and I believe also vouchers. And then this just says that if you did use that option 2 and you had fewer than 3 years, that the board would require that these entities submit clean independent audits annually. And they must do that until full approval is achieved, which must be achieved within 5 years. And then we would retain the right to rescind that conditional approval if anything in those financial audits gave us concern. Any questions?
Questions? Any questions? Okay. How many more do you have, Amy?
None. I'm done.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Let's move to the leader preparation program approvals. Paul, I believe you have that. And as Amy noted, we are behind, so we're going to make that. Unless we just want to stay here tonight and convene our board meeting here.
Where's that? Oh, in here. Great. Do we have that? Well, great. Well, good afternoon. And on the spirit of moving with urgency and purpose with EPPs, both with the content and the presentation, we will keep that in mind. I'm also really excited to have Michael with us, as Michael Derline has done a lot of our leader preparation work and led that. And so I want to give you a quick update on a couple pieces that were what we call our two phases on the leader preparation work to complement the EPP work that has been occurring. One is the phase 1 really hits everything from 2014 through January of 2015, exactly a year ago. And I'll go through that very briefly, and then Michael's going to walk through the work that's been done in this last 12 months around the 3 programs in a way that needed additional review time and process for the status that they were in from a year ago. And so what that looks like, let's see if we can get this to work here, that's the timeline. And as I mentioned, Michael will be walking through the phase 2, which really began in January of 2015, all the way through the recommendations that we'll be bringing today through tomorrow. And that, a couple quick reminders. Reminder that there are 4 areas for leader preparation programs that are being considered, and as you heard even just with the IWGs, the importance of partnerships with LEAs, and that's the main first criterion for leader prep programs. Second, with candidate selection. Third, with program curriculum, and finally the field-based practicum that are important for our leader candidates. And so just a reminder of that's the criteria and the rubrics that were developed by the review teams as we went through. And Michael's team did a great work at compiling review teams that, as you see, were representative of leader prep programs, K-12 practitioner and leaders, folks from our staff, and also other outside organizations like TOS that led that work in the last year. Specifically in phase 1, which was the initial review process for our 20 leader preparation programs, and then for phase 2, as you're going to hear more about in just a moment. Quick reminder where we are. And this is a little small, but we had the 16 leader preparation programs that were granted full approval exactly a year ago. In fact, I stood before you and talked about those for the 16 that you see here that are granted the full approval. And then these are the 4 that had the stipulations, either minor or major, from the 4 programs that is now we're going to be talking about phase 2. from January of 15 a year ago until now, and all the work that's been done with these four specifically. So I'm going to turn it to Michael now on the phase 2 for what that really means for those programs.
All kinds of stuff here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. So just a few, thank you. So a few reminders. These are the recommendation options outlined in the Learning Centered Leadership Policy. So full approval, 7 years, approval with stipulations, and denial of approval. And what we did was the rubric we developed, we fit that into these recommendations. So if a program met or exceeded all expectations for all criteria, we're recommending full approval. If they met expectations for 3 of the 4 criteria, approval with stipulations. And if they met it for fewer than 3, then they would be recommended for denial of approval. I'm going to talk a little bit about each program. One program you won't see up here is the University of Memphis, but you'll see in your action item that they elected to close their program, redesign a brand new program, and propose that for conditional approval. That program was conditionally approved just very recently. But the University of Chattanooga resubmitted a lot of documentation related to their preparation curriculum. Previously, they had aligned their coursework to the previous iteration of the TILs, and they have since revised their alignment matrices, key assessment benchmarks, evaluation tools, and then provided a narrative that kind of tied it all together. And our recommendation there would be full approval, and you'll see that tomorrow. Bethel University, somewhat similar. They revised partnership documents, and then some of their evaluation tools related to their candidate assessment, and the recommendation tomorrow will be full approval. And then MTSU, they had 4 sections where they needed to revise documentation and provide additional evidence. And in 3 of the 4 sections, they were deemed to have met the expectation. But in the assessment system piece, the review team determined that they did not meet expectations. And the detail that you have, I think, is probably sufficient, but it provides the feedback that MTSU received from the review team and the specific concerns that they had. And that's why the recommendation tomorrow will be approval with stipulations. And then next steps, so MTSU is still in the review process then. And next steps for MTSU is to develop and communicate an improvement plan, which we've already started. We have a pretty aggressive timeline for them, so beginning in April and then in June, we're going to ask for specific benchmarks to have been met. We're going to select review team members this spring and have an on-site review in the summer. And then we will be bringing a recommendation to you of either full approval or denial of approval in October 2016. And then thinking ahead about policy recommendations, I think we've learned a whole lot from this process. One of the big takeaways was that it's still pretty heavily input focused. So I think one huge thing we'd like to do is really start to think about how can we better align the leader prep policy with the educator preparation policy. So thinking about things like annual reporting and report cards, streamlining some of the tools that we use for the process, and surveys, I think would all be part of some of the changes we'd be interested in making. And then that all, we would provide updates to you all probably in the fall or winter of this coming year. Any questions?
Could you back up one slide?
Yes.
Are these 4 equally, I assume they are equally weighted?
Yes. This is aligned to the outline of the Learning Center Leadership Policy. For each section, we have 3 or 4 indicators, and each indicator had basically a rating for each item. So yes.
Is there anything that, any deficiency that a school might have cause you more heartburn than maybe another deficiency that a school might have?
Just personally, my assessment system assessment system is huge. It's a big one. The curriculum piece, I think, is a large one, but I think they're all extraordinarily important. Partnership, as you know, you've seen with the Ed Prep policy, is a huge focus. So, I mean, I would say assessment system is a big one. But again, this was very input focused. So we were looking at nitty gritty documents and procedures, but the assessment system was a much broader sort of item.
And a quick example would be, you remember the leadership policy was passed in 2008, and so you think how much has changed in terms of the TILs being revised in 2013. You have the administrator rubric coming online at the same time. So a lot of our programs, and specifically on this one, they had assessment tools, but the alignment and the cohesion to the revised TILs is what was lacking. And that was also a concern, because I think that's where the rubber hits the road of preparing these candidates and completers for what they're going to be facing in schools with the TILs and the principal rubric. That didn't exist, as we know, when the policy was passed in 2008. So I think that's another piece that's important.
Okay, other questions?
Thank you.
Okay. Michael, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep, thanks.
Okay, Paul, you still got this one, educator talent?
Yep. I'm going to let Sylvia Flowers kick it off for the equity report. We're excited to give you both the hard copy and then also this overview for Sylvia leading our human capital work in our division. And there's the mic there that we started. And then Lacey will continue with some of the groundbreaking work on equity work with the research and the data once we get that.
Good afternoon. My name is Sylvia Flowers, and I have with me Lacey Hartigan from the Data and Research Team, and we're going to give you an overview of Tennessee's plan for ensuring access to effective teachers. We'll start by giving you a little background about the purpose of this study and how it fits with our work. We'll share with you our approach to how we think about students' access to effective teaching, and then get into a little bit of the analysis around our supply and our access, and then talk about what's next. So just to give you a little context and background, this plan, and you guys have a copy of it in front of you, was required by the U.S. Department of Education, and we submitted a plan in June of 2015, and after some revisions and going back and forth, it was approved in October of 2015. This is not anything new. We had previously submitted plans back in 2006 and 2010, and mostly at that time we focused on what we consider input measures like highly qualified teachers, novice teachers, and teachers who are teaching in field versus out of field. And so we really looked at this as an opportunity to look and use our evaluation data to consider the issues of access using the lens of effectiveness. We were also chosen to work with a small cohort of states and really begin digging into this early on before the plan was due in June. So we went through actually a couple of iterations of our plan back in 2014 and early 2015 before we got to this point. There we go. And so while this was a requirement for the U.S. Department of Education, we really feel like it fits really nicely with what we're already doing in Tennessee, and it currently aligns really well with our strategic plan and specifically the priority area of all means all. So we do have a specific strategy around increasing equity of access to highly effective teachers, and you'll see here some of the action steps that we've developed and that we will be focusing on over the next 3 to 4 years, and some of the outcomes that we hope to achieve through this work. And again, we have been focused on the human capital continuum over the last few years, and so we know that one of the key levers to drive improvement is the quality of people that we have working in our schools and districts. And so we are a state that has a ton of rich data, and this data allows us to really drive towards strategies and make the best decisions we can about who is teaching our students. This slide just shows the components of the plan. You all will have time to read those 50 pages at your leisure. But there is a theory of action section, data, a stakeholder engagement requirement, And we did a lot of thinking around some of the root causes and potential strategies that we're going to focus on, as well as how this is going to be part of an ongoing support and monitoring opportunity. While that was the required structure, we did have a great deal of flexibility to decide how we were going to define equity and how we were going to look at equity gaps. And so what we chose to do is to look at equity based on our supply of effective teachers and students' access to these effective teachers. And so we chose to define highly effective teachers as teachers who are scoring a level 4 or level 5 on TVAS in ELA and math. And really we focused on that because we know that a level 4 or 5 score means that students tended to show more growth than expected. Our initial plan that you guys have in front of you, the analysis really only took into account grades 4 through 8 ELA and math. And this year we're adding the 9 through 12 EOC subjects, and that's the data we'll be showing you today and the data that will go out to districts later in February. So when we think about students' access to effective teachers, we know that there are many factors that impact that. And the first is a district supply of effective teachers. And that might be the pipeline of teachers who are entering the profession, as Amy's group is working on, but it also consists of the supply that they have right now today. And we know that we spend a lot of time on the growth and development of our existing staff, so that's also an opportunity. And then we look at how those teachers are distributed, either within schools or between schools in a district. And I'm going to let Lacey talk about the data piece, and I'll hold this.
Oh, thanks.
No, you'll hold that.
Okay, great.
And I'll click.
Good afternoon, everyone. If you can't see any of the numbers on your copies or up here, just let me know and I'll call them out. So what this graph shows is, this is a table of, we looked at below basic students, so students who scored at our lowest proficiency level in 2013. And we wanted to look at how these students performed after 2 years of having a highly effective teacher, that's the bar on the right, or not having a highly effective teacher, and that's the bar on the left. So what we saw is for below basic students, for the students who did not have access to a highly effective teacher, and this is in 4-8 math, 66% of them were still below basic when tested 2 years later. So again, below basic is our lowest proficiency level, as opposed to 43% of them stayed below basic after 2 years of a highly effective teacher. We know how hard it is to move students from below basic to other proficiency levels, so seeing this big difference, while we only still moved 43% to basic after 2 years of highly effective teaching, that is actually a really big move. Based on what we know about students' movement and how 2 years is really not that long of a time. So we were very excited. I was really excited when I saw these numbers. And we saw that 11% of our below basic students, when they had access to a highly effective teacher for 2 years, moved to proficient. And statewide, the numbers of below basic students that moved to proficient in the course of 2 years, it's really, really small. Based on other analyses we've done. So while 11% is still not as high as we would like it, this was really positive data. So we know that having a highly effective teacher, we see it playing out in our data that it matters. The research tells us it matters, but we saw in our Tennessee data that it did matter in math. And this was also the case in ELA. If we look at the next slide. We've seen not a lot of movement in ELA in our students over the last couple years, which is why it's a big part of our strategic plan. But we saw this movement even in ELA. For our below basic students, after having a highly effective teacher for 2 years, they scored basic, 57% of them scored basic, which is a move up. It is a move up. We still didn't get many of them to proficient, unfortunately. But we did see that over half of our below basic students in both ELA and math, when given access to a highly effective teacher, moved up at least one proficiency level.
And so we focused on supply first because we know that our supply of effective teachers varies It varies at the district level, but it also varies within our subjects and grade levels. So here you'll see the breakdown of our TVOS distribution by subject and grade bands. So you start with math on the left side of the graph, 4 through 8 math, and move across the graph to ELA subjects, all the way to our ELC subjects, English 1, 2, and 3. So as you can see, we tend to have more highly effective TVOS level 4 and 5 growth in our math subjects than we do our ELA subjects. And when we look at the district level,
we see this, that districts really vary in their supply of highly effective teachers. So each one of these little tiny bars represents a district. And so the upper left-hand graph is 4-8 math, the upper right is 4-8 English language arts. We have EOC math on our lower left and EOC ELA. So this represents the proportion of teachers in each district that has a level 4 or 5 TVOS, so we're defining them as highly effective. So we see the state average for 4-8 math, well, maybe you can see it, maybe you can't, is about 47.5%. So across the state, on average, about 47% of our 4-8 math teachers are highly effective within a district. You see the state line for 4-8 ELA and how low that is. The state average for ELA is 24%. So across the state, we have a much smaller supply of highly effective 4-8 ELA teachers. And then our EOC levels are both are closer to one another. So we do see this really big shortage of highly effective teachers in 4-8 ELA, which based on the TVOS graph that Sylvia just showed you wasn't surprising, but it was definitely alarming. So we see that supply is an issue across the state. And if you'll notice, even our max district, so our highest district, the maximum was about 60%. So we don't have, in 4-8 ELA, we don't have any districts that have a really high number of highly effective teachers.
and just to add to that, when we start talking about our strategies, we know that because this varies so much, how we approach our districts will very much depend as well. So a district who has 10% of their teachers are scoring level 4 and 5, the strategies around addressing supply will be very different than someone who's on the further right part of that graph. Yeah.
Do the slide, please.
Oh, sorry. This one. Yes.
So, in looking at how we are using these highly effective teachers throughout the state, we wanted to think about how we, what data schools have to inform their student-teacher matching process, and what data we have access to. So what we did for this analysis is we took teacher TVOS data from the 13-14 school year and student proficiency level data from the 13-14 school year and looked at how they were matched in 14-15. So we wanted to see if districts are placing their lowest achievement level kids with their highly effective teachers, or if the most advanced, higher performing kids are getting the highly effective teachers. So this is what we looked at for this analysis. You go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. So we created what we're calling an effective teaching gap. And the way we look at that is it's the percent of students in one group with access to highly effective teaching minus the percent of students in another group with access to a highly effective teaching. So for our example that we're going to talk about today, we looked at the percentage of advanced students, so that's our highest proficiency level. We looked at how many of those students were given access to a highly effective teacher. Subtracting from that, the percentage of our lowest achievement level, our below basic students, how many of them were getting access to a highly effective teacher. And if there's a gap, we would hope that it's a negative gap, because that means that when you don't have highly effective teachers for everyone, you are giving more access to your lowest achieving kids. So a negative gap is a good thing, a really big positive gap is a bad thing, basically. So looking at the data, we did, as Sylvia mentioned, we ran, so the 2014 data, we ran the 4-8 math and ELA, so I included those on here. And then this year we expanded and also ran the EOC data. So you see that in 4-8 math, our gap statewide is about 9.5%. whereas last year it was about 6.5%. In ELA, we see about 4.4%, and last year it was about 1.5%. In EOC math, we see the largest gap at about 10%, and then EOC, ELA, English Language Arts, about 0.8%. So, not that these are great numbers, but it is not 50% statewide. So, that's good. And this makes sense based on when we look at those district distributions, we have some districts that have a really, really big gap, and I'm going to get more into that, and some that don't have much of a gap. So in terms of strategies for targeting this, it's going to be very district specific. And that's something we're keeping in mind as we're working through what we do with this data.
And we also looked at the other subgroups, and you'll find last year's analysis in the report that you have in front of you, and we also have that information as well.
So this is looking at the effective teaching gap for every district. So again, every little bar represents a different district in Tennessee. So this is for 4-8 English Language Arts, and you see the state average effective teaching gap. So again, this is the percent of advanced students with highly effective teachers minus the percent of below basic students with highly effective teachers. You see the state average is about 1.5%. So that's not a big gap. That's actually not all good news though. We couldn't see big gaps because we have such a low supply of 4-8 ELA teachers that no one has like 80% of their kids in any proficiency level assigned to highly effective teachers. So while the gaps look smaller in ELA, I would caution you to interpret that in the context of the supply, that our supply for 4-8 ELA is low. So it makes sense that the gaps are smaller. So you'll see some districts do have a negative gap, which means that when they have a gap, they are assigning more of their below basic kids to highly effective teachers. And then we have up to a 20 percentage point gap that would mean that 20% more advanced kids are being assigned to highly effective teaching. Just of a note for these, you had to have at least 6 tested teachers to be included in the analysis. We didn't want to create a gap for a district that had 2 teachers. So we only did it for districts that met that minimum end count, which was most districts. So this is the 4-8 math effective teaching gap distribution. So the state average is again 9.5%, and we see we still have some districts with negative gaps. And for this, we had 35 districts with negative gaps in 4-8 math, but we had over 100 of our districts that had a gap. And you'll see some of these gaps are as large as 40%. So if you'll notice, we are calling out an example district where this district has an overall effective teaching gap of 2.8%. That's all well and good, but what does that mean? What do we do with that? And so what we have done is we've broken it out also at the school level so that a district can say, okay, my gap is 2.8, but what does that mean? What do I do with that? So we'll be giving them this information broken down at the school level so that they can see exactly where potential issues might be. So this is the 4-8 effective teaching gap for schools in this example district. Looking at the school level, we can see where the gaps are coming from. For example, if you look at 4-8 math, which are the yellow bars, you'll see that they're mostly in this bottom school here. This bottom school has an effective teaching gap of 11.8%.
So School A
there
has a large positive effective teaching gap.
Right.
Versus School F has a large negative effective teaching gap.
So while the district overall, their gap is 2.8, you see that School F, the top district, they don't seem to have a problem with their math at all, whereas School A may have a large problem. So this is just kind of getting at nuanced information that people can use. And maybe there are strategies that they can use between their schools, and maybe more so at the district level, depending on what this data looks like.
So when we think back to that human capital continuum slide, then we would be working with districts to come up with differentiated strategies to address some of these patterns that are happening in certain groups of schools that may not be happening in other schools. So are there incentives for teachers to teach at School A versus School F? Are there leadership and culture issues at School A versus School F? And helping districts really think through what is happening at the school level so that they can then begin to build those human capital strategies that address the issues. And so that leads us to the what's next.
Yeah.
You want to talk about
Sure.
some of our plans?
Take that. So if you can imagine, we have this really now strong, robust set of data, and we've had it now for several years. If you're a typical superintendent or principal, the understanding that's going to take place in the communication on our end and their need to understand what this means for their district and for the school is a pretty tall order and a good order, and this is the direction we want to go in 2016 around these two phases. If you hit the next slide, it'll show about in two ways this is going to be distributed, and we're going to be continuing to have really important conversations with districts and superintendents. One, what you just heard on the equity report is the second part now of what we call the human capital reports. Last year was the first year that human capital reports were released to every district around 4 areas, and this is the part 1, if you see, around distribution of teacher scores, around their growth from year to year, like the percent of teachers moving from a 2 to a 3, 3 to a 4, around recruitment and retention. And that will be coming out really in the next week for this year's human capital report based on last year's data. So that's a huge tool that previously, before last year, did not exist for districts to think about, as Sylvia mentioned, this entire human capital spectrum of being more strategic with supply of teachers, selection and retention, and also placement of teachers within schools, both in school and between schools. Second then is the equity analysis, and this will be the second part released as part of the human capital reports. So there's so much there, to our earlier points. We wanted to make sure it was kind of separated into part 1, which are the human capital reports, and then part 2 is the equity report. Also, and I'm really glad Dr. Earhart is here as well, because she's done a lot of really important work on helping districts refine their E-Plan and their district strategic plans on an electronic portal called E-Plan. And what's going to be groundbreaking is now putting all of this data, both human capital reports and equity reports, in a very much like a format like Walmart. So it's the one-stop shopping for districts who, when they have to build out their strategic plan, they don't have to go find their equity password, their human capital password, their ACT password, all of those pieces, their federal funding piece, all that's going to live in this one consolidated E-Plan. And I know as a previous high school principal, I think at one time I had 10 different passwords, and I think some of you can relate to that, of just keeping track of it, 2, when you're having to build out district and school strategic plans, you want all of that in one spot, and it really needs to be there. And I think that's the piece that's going to going forward. So I'm glad that Dr. Earhart's here to recognize that work that's happening. So that's really what's all coming based on what you have in front of you, and you can imagine there's a lot to digest from there if you're a typical district thinking now differently about growing your teachers and placing them more strategically. And that's what you saw already with our strategic plan that fits in this slide as a repeat on the all means all. And then it just goes back to the key takeaways that we do right now have fewer highly effective teachers in ELA than in math. We have more below basic students have less access to highly effective teachers than advanced students. And then we hope these human capital reports will build upon this really being more strategic about the importance of teachers, how important teachers and growing teachers and moving them along a continuum of effectiveness have huge implications for our students. So that's where we are. So I know we are, again, very much over time, but wanted to make sure this was brought to you this point as we're getting ready to release. Anything else?
We're ready for questions.
What real power does the state, or the state department is in doing something about this? You know, present it and jawbone it, but isn't that the extent of what we can do about it?
So we have like a 4-phase plan, starting with phase 0, which is continuing the work that we have been doing. And we're really in phase 1 and phase 2. I think our ultimate goal is building toward public transparency and having this information available, of which we know also creates a little bit more motivation.
That's kind of what I was going the only way, I don't want to say the report part, but somehow or another, how they manage their human capital has consequences. And they may not be telling anybody, but someone else could, if we have the ability to track it.
Mm-hmm. So we, of course, intend to look at this every year. We think it's really important. Our core offices are chomping at the bit to get these data reports and start working with our districts. And we do want to give them some time to focus on it. But as you see, eventually we're moving toward how this fits into our revised report card.
I think also, if I could add, the new accountability system is integrating a measure for reduction in below basic. So if you reduce your number of students who score below basic over time, and so while it's not measuring this explicitly, if we tell districts this is one strategy to help reduce your below basic kids is give them your highly effective teachers, don't just let your highly effective teachers teach your more advanced classes, then it's sort of tied in a way.
Okay, Wendy?
So I have a couple data questions and then I have a bigger question. Is when you're showing the districts, is the ASD included as a district in that?
ASD was excluded.
Excluded, okay. In the districts that have charter schools, are the charter schools included in their teachers' class?
If they're included in accountability data, so that's a good question. If it's in the accountability data file, because that's what I build this from, so that is a good question. I can't say definitively either way.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I can find out and email you.
Okay, yeah, no, that would be great. And then slide 14, this is sort of a bigger question, and then
This
So
one, the
am I
four
reading
distributions.
this right? So that graph is supposed to be from all the way on the left to all the way on the right. So in all of these, there are actually districts that have 0 level 4 or 5s in front of 4 through 8
Yes.
ELA, 4 through 8 math.
Yes.
Correct.
Is the data available on like what numbers those represent as far as kids or like what size those districts are?
So you had to even have a 0, you had to have at least 6 tested teachers.
Right.
So you would have to have at least 6 tested teachers in 4-8 math. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the size.
I guess I'm curious if there are, not that it's ideal for any district to have no high performing teachers, but if I'm curious what numbers of kids don't have that option in their entire district.
That's a really good question. I could aggregate that.
That would be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike?
So, why is there such a low number of 4 and 5 teachers in LEA?
Part of that, and I can't get into this too much because I am not an expert on TVOS. So disclaimer, not an expert on TVOS. Part of that is the way that TVOS is calculated, using a baseline year for 480 LA. And Dr. McQueen, please chime in if I say anything wrong. So the way it's calculated is compared to a baseline. Currently, it will be switching next year to the intra-year calculation, which is what the EOC's already used. And all that is to say is that the baseline year that it's comparing to for ELA was higher than we currently are doing. And so we've kind of been playing catch-up in terms of how TVOS is calculated. So
And while we've made great gains in the math portion, we have not
Right.
made those similar types of gains on the ELA 4
Right.
through 8.
if you look at our state level ELA over the last 5 years, it's just stagnant. We haven't gone up in our percent of proficient or advanced, and so that is reflected in our TVOS, and in particular because of the way TVOS is calculated for 4-8 subjects.
At some point in time, that'd be a pretty good thing for us to talk about in here is what the deal is on reading.
Yeah.
So, let me just speak to that, which this data is certainly showing what we've already seen in terms of student performance. And from a student performance perspective, all data that we have from a variety of sources shows that reading is still a challenge for us, particularly in these early grade levels, but that continues on with English, 1, 2, and 3. And so it's a challenge for all of us. We hope that you got an invitation to our Read to Be Ready kickoff event, which is on February 17th from 1 to 3 at the City little bit of a challenge.
So where is it in Oxford?
No, you.
I just wanna note too, because we had a great discussion this morning with the board as we're sort of finalizing the master plan, and we talked about early grade reading in particular, and noted that it wasn't in our master plan as an actionable item for 2016, in part because we really need to understand more about what the state is telling us, and what are the strategies, what are the policy changes potentially, or the pushes of the state that we need to take potentially soon, but, you know, as we know more. So I do think, even if you're not able to go to that unveiling, that'll be something that the board probably wants to get a report on and talk about more in April, because I do think, like you said, Commissioner, this is another really compelling data point that's indicting of that sort of early grades reading. And it also connects back to our teacher prep conversation. I think the need to think about the content expertise and the foundational literacy and the standards this morning. I mean, nothing happens in isolation. These are all connected challenges.
And we would promote, we have a statute on the books that is around third grade retention, because students are not reading at a proficient level, and there's all kinds of wording around intervention and what that looks like, and it's district led. That's a potential item for us to discuss, that we will be putting out in some complexity around that, and what we do next, and how other states have attempted to address the same issue. So we would love to have the opportunity to talk about that in a future board meeting.
So when we were, being presented the new LEA standards for, coming up, was there a new reset button on third grade reading and language?
There were some, I think what I would call some robustness that was added to the foundational literacy standards. If
So-
you saw that they had sort of separated those out and made it, I feel like much more robust in how they.
But third grades reading
Shannon's in the room if you want
Yes.
anything.
So we actually looked at it not just as a third grade issue, but what's happening in kindergarten through second grade for them to then be ready for third grade. So you'll see some additional strands in those earlier grades that are prepping them for that third grade reading expectation.
Okay?
One, I want to commend excellent information. This information is so compelling. I think going forward, we need to make sure it is transparent within the districts. This information needs to be out there. It should not be within the ballpark. It needs to be outside of the ballpark.
And I would connect it to one other thing, because we just talked about the teacher prep report card. Sarah and I are talking about the next iteration of the report card for teacher prep, and there are some specific challenges that we see in terms of teacher effectiveness, obviously around some of our Tennessee Succeeds Challenge, which are reading specifically, and we feel like there are some ways that we can be more transparent on that report card around these issues and how that maps back to what we're getting out of teacher preparation. So we hope to bring you some drafts of what that might look like, to put some new measures around these priorities directly on those report cards for teacher preparation.
Okay? Other questions? Okay, good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next item is the statewide dual credit overview.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You know, it's one of these things where you always keep being like near the end, like the caboose, because everyone's getting a little tired. So, Sarah said something really powerful just a few minutes ago, which is that nothing happens in isolation. And within education, we think about a K-12 continuum. Our discussion around early post-secondary flows right into that. So just as the importance of early grades starts this process for our young people, the work around early post-secondary helps lead them out of the K-12 system and into post-secondary and readiness in the workforce. So tomorrow you'll be taking up 2 courses for first reading. These are 2 courses that are actually piloting out of our statewide dual credit program. And so leading into that consideration for tomorrow, we thought it would be helpful to revisit the state's early post-secondary program, so that one, you can see in a high level all the different activities that we're taking on, and then that will lead again into that more specific conversation around statewide dual credit courses themselves. So to help you visually along, we put some little mini posters on your tables that are visually appealing, is what I've been told. And so we're glad that you guys have those available. If anyone does want additional copies for either your stakeholders or for individuals within your area, please let us know. We do have extras that we can get to you. But I'm going to step aside and I'm going to have Patrice Watson, who serves as our director for the Office of Early Post-Secondary, lead you through this presentation, and also be remiss not to introduce Ms. Casey Hogner-Wren over there, if you can wave, who is our executive director for student readiness and early post-secondary, who's joined us as well.
All right, so I'm going to move as quickly as possible through this presentation. All right, but I want to talk about the what. What is statewide dual credit? The how are these courses developed? And then the where does our office plan to go from here as it relates to statewide dual credit? And lastly, why? Why are these type of initiatives and early post-secondary opportunities so important to our students across the state? So, as you may know, PC 459 was a precursor to what we have now, PC 967, which calls for the expansion of all existing early post-secondary opportunities, as well as the development of a communication strategy, a strategic plan, as well as the reporting and tracking of data across all of these opportunities. Out of PC 967 came the creation of the Consortium for Cooperative Innovative Education, which consists of post-secondary and secondary agencies, with TBR and UT serving as the co-chair for this consortium. So although I'm going to spend most of my time today, brief time today, talking about the statewide dual credit pilot, I do want to reiterate that our office, as well as the consortium, has been tasked with the expansion of all early post-secondary opportunities across the state. Those include dual enrollment, which is a course taught at the post-secondary by a credentialed post-secondary faculty member or adjunct member. We also have local dual credit, statewide dual credit, AP, IB, and Cambridge, which differ from dual credit in that they are courses with an exam at the end. These courses are also taught at the high school by a high school teacher. And then lastly, we have CLEP, and then our capstone industry certification that has an exam only. So just wanted to make sure that you're aware, and you also have this nice poster that gives you some descriptions of each of those initiatives. All right, so let's jump right into the statewide dual credit pilot. One of the key components of this pilot is that we have all the right people around the table. Collaboration between the department, TBR, THEC, TACUA, and UT is important to the success of this pilot. The course selection is based on workforce trends, vertical alignment to post-secondary programs, and of course, student interests. So you asked me, how are these courses developed? They were developed by post-secondary faculty across the state. So across systems, which include UT, TACUA, as well as TBR. They came together and they developed the learning objectives and challenge exams for these courses. Now, in order to participate in this pilot, districts have to sign a memorandum of understanding. And then one key thing that I want to pull out here is that all students enrolled in a statewide dual credit course are required to sit for that challenge exam. So the statewide dual credit pilot began in 2013 with 3 courses: college algebra, agriculture business finance, and greenhouse management. During the 14-15 school year, we added 2 courses to the pilot: sociology and criminal justice, for a total of 5. And we currently have 7 courses under the pilot, with 3 new additions: pre-calculus, which replaced college algebra, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, health information technology, and statistics. So as you can see, as the years went on, we expanded the course offering, and we also, the participation rate expanded as well. Where we started with 102 schools participating, we now have 168 participating in the pilot. All right, so let's talk about the challenge exam. So I told you who developed the challenge exam, faculty work group, and what the challenge exam is, an online challenge exam that is administered through the Tennessee Board of Regents online assessment platform, Desire to Learn. So as you can see, the types of questions are pretty consistent across all of the courses. However, sociology does have an essay component, but the numbers of questions, the time limit, and the cut score vary across courses. One reason for this is that each course should mimic what a student would experience at the post-secondary level. And so the cut scores and the time limit and everything that goes into the challenge exam was determined by the faculty work group. And one thing to note here is that the courses and exams must meet SACS accreditation requirements. So after a course goes through the first year of the pilot, then it goes through what we call a validation process, which is led by post faculty. And what they do is they come back together, they look at the learning objectives, they look at the challenge exam questions, and if there's misalignment identified, they make adjustments or they remove a course from the pilot. Those adjustments would look like revisions of the learning objectives and the challenge exam, removal. And the example that I provided earlier is where college algebra is no longer offered, is because what they found is that college algebra did not necessarily align to a program, a post-secondary mathematic program. And then there was a huge component of trigonometry missing from college algebra. So what they did was replace college algebra with our pre-calculus course. So if a student meets or exceeds the challenge exam, they bank credits. So the credit is not actually awarded or transcripted until that student enrolls in the Tennessee Public Post-Secondary Institution of their choice. Now what we do is we place that score on the high school transcript so that that transcript becomes a score report, since this is a state-led initiative. But the student has some responsibility in this. They have a responsibility to contact the records office to ensure that that credit is received. All right, so let's talk about the challenge exam's results. This graph shows you from fall 2013 to spring of 2015. So one thing that we noticed from this graph is that the pass rate varies from semester and also by year, which is not surprising. So this is no different than an AP exam where the pass rate varies depending on different variables. Student population may change. Instructional time sometimes is lost. And I know I want to address one thing on here, which is the elephant in the room, is our criminal justice scores, the pass rate. So what we found from this, from 2014-15, is that there was some misalignment when it came to the post-secondary and the secondary course. And we had to talk to our districts and take more of a kind of approach in student placement into the courses. What students should be placed in the course as far as the classification. We also brought the faculty work group back together to come up with different additional resources and materials for our teachers to lead them to success in these courses. So going forward, what can you expect from our office? Continued development and revisions of statewide marketing strategies for all opportunities. We want to make sure that we expand advanced placement programs across the state. We are in the final phase of developing an early post-secondary database that will house the scores from these opportunities that will be accessible to our districts as well as our post-secondary institutions. Expand dual enrollment and dual credit partnerships between TCATs and LEAs. And then lastly, continue the development of additional statewide dual credit courses, which brings me to the reason why I'm standing here today. So, every course that's under the pilot goes through a three-year life cycle. Agriculture, business, finance, and greenhouse management are in their final pilot year. So what we're recommending is that we transition these two courses out of pilot so that they are their own standalone course with their own high school course code. And Danielle will talk more about that during tomorrow's first reading. So I promised you at the beginning of this presentation that I would tell you the why. So why is this important? Not only can a student earn college credit while in high school, but it also builds confidence in a student. It also exposes them to post-secondary level coursework. And that student that was not thinking about college prior to participating in some type of early post-secondary opportunity may reconsider. And this gives them the confidence to know that post-secondary is achievable for me as a student in the state of Tennessee. Any questions?
Questions? Mike?
How'd you all pick the courses you picked?
So the courses were based on workforce trends, so we looked at what the workforce would look like up into 2025, say, for example. We looked at the vertical alignment of programs, post-secondary programs. And so post-secondary, our partners played a big role in what courses were selected and what ones were important at the post-secondary level, and as well as looking at student enrollment in some of these courses. Like, for instance, psychology. We looked at the number of high school students that were enrolled in the psychology course. Did we have some student interest there? Which then we brought before the consortium, and they make the final approval.
And just real quick, you want to mention too, one of the other variables that we also look at is the Tennessee Transfer Pathways Program, which is essential. It's the post-secondary vertical alignment. That's how they make sure that these certain core courses are transferable no matter where you start, whether it's at a community college or four-year.
Yeah.
So we look at both of those when you look at the
So
Gen
how
Ed
they-
as well as the CTE courses.
One of your early screens, you had algebra, was it algebra two?
College algebra?
And it dropped off.
It did.
Did you all discontinue doing that one?
So when it went through the validation, good question. When it went through the validation process, the faculty found that there was some misalignment to post-secondary mathematic programs, and that college algebra course was missing a component of trigonometry. So then it was removed and replaced to pre-calculus, which is a better fit for those students that will be majoring in a STEM or business field.
Okay, other questions? Okay.
Right.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Joy, you've been patiently waiting here. Hope you've been working on how you can present it very quickly.
I'm a fan of brevity, so we'll be all right, so I promise. So. Right, and I brought the person with me who can do it quickly, so that's Allison Gall, our low incidence and behavior coordinator. Just to get started, we do have guests with us today, and these are individuals that served on our educational interpreter task force. I think we have 8 members from the task force with us. They began this work in early 2015 and spent a whole year doing this work. So to see their commitment, they showed up for today's workshop and tomorrow's board meeting. So we appreciate the great work they did on this. For deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing students, as we think about access to effective communication, and we particularly think about our goals of all means all and post-secondary transition, we know that it's very important that they have access to qualified educational interpreters. And after doing some research, what we realized in Tennessee is that there weren't licenses for educational interpreters in our state. And in fact, based on that, many of our qualified interpreters choose to work in other states. This was brought to us by several members of the deaf community in higher ed, and that's why we2 this work. Allison will walk through the 5 recommendations that we'll have in front of you tomorrow for first read. It impacts 2 rules and 3 policies, and we'll have those for you on first reading tomorrow. With that, Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. So again, really thank you to the task force. I came in very late in the game, and so this is really their work, and I'm fortunate enough to share that today. So this is really that why, that rationale, as Joey touched on. We have a desperate need for high-quality interpreters, but I think one of the things that we forget when we're looking at this is an interpreter does not simply take speech and put it into sign and sign into speech. They are that first language, that primary language mentor for that student as well. And if that student doesn't have quality mentorship in language, then their language skills are not going to develop and become increasingly more sophisticated. And the things, just like that dual certification, are not available unless they have that sophisticated understanding of language, because learning is language-based. So there is a need beyond just making sure that they can take speech to sign and sign to speech, but that they can make sure that that student also is growing and developing in their language. That is a critical piece to this. you can see that that critical piece, that understanding of language, leads to success. It leads to the career and college success. Right now, our employment rate for individuals who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind is often below 10%. And that's not okay. And this is just one pathway to help change that statistic. What we have found in this is that our interpreters from our 2 programs here in the state leave. They're paid better elsewhere, not very far away. One of the advantages and disadvantages of Tennessee is its length across from west to east. But that means that going north to south is a short distance. So it is quite easy to go to a neighboring state. And so we lose those high quality interpreters to our neighboring states. And we need to find a way to keep them here. This data, I know, is a little difficult to see on here. I believe you have the handout as well. This data was taken from a training that was done. And I think when you look at it, you realize that the great majority of the people that were participating in this training, and of course, you know, people participating in professional development, we already know, are high quality. But even from that high quality, the great majority of them received their instruction and sign from church, family, or friends. It was an extracurricular activity, a hobby that led them into that field of interpreting. How they got there, that's, you know, powerful. We really believe in extracurricular. But do we know that they were truly trained in that language the way that we need them to be trained to help develop that primary language for individuals who are using sign language as their first language? So it leads us to question it. You can see the second one was the interpreting and training program, but some people even received it through an adult education class, a high school class, college, or a classmate. From that, we also looked at some compensation data. Again, I realize it's difficult to see, but in Tennessee, on average, we're paying hourly of $11 to $27 an hour, with the median there being around $17 an hour, which figures out to an hour or a yearly wage of $16,000 to $24,000. In Alabama, they're making on average a year $35,000, more than twice what we're paying here, just a short distance away. In Georgia, it's $33,000 a year. Virginia, $35,000 a year. Illinois, it's $25 an hour, which is still almost twice what we're paying an hour in many places. And in Texas, it's $13 an hour at the university. And if you have that certification, but $25 an hour, the more you know and the more fluent you are in your sign. So, I mean, they're paying twice as much as us. It's easy to see why they will drive a distance to get to work. That's pretty substantial. With our training program, yeah.
So we're paying what? I can't see it.
Yeah, we're paying them an average of $14,000 a year to $24,000 a year. In Alabama, they're getting about $35,000 a year.
So that's about half the poverty rate.
Yeah, I didn't feel I needed to put salt in that wound, but I appreciate you pointing it out for us. And I'm sure our interpreters today are grateful that you're advocating for that as well. So we do have 2 training programs in the state, and they are both in the East. Our hope is not only will we keep high quality interpreters, but because we're keeping them and because we're paying well, we're going to continue to see more and more training programs arise because we have that growing need, but we know that we can keep those individuals within the state of Tennessee. So why not move to Tennessee, be trained in Tennessee, and then stay and work and live in Tennessee? In addition, so from this, we are proposing that this become a licensure proposal. We would like to see education interpreters being put in the school services personnel. They would then be paid adequate in that they would be paid as our teachers are paid. That would be a substantial increase, as you see, in pay. But that comes with the caveat that they would hold a minimum of a bachelor's degree and be nationally certified, or they could follow the alternative route in passing the national certification at a 3.5 proficiency level, which is quite high. That's a high standard on that level. So that would really secure high quality educational interpreters, and we would have a way to also know that they're high quality educational interpreters. Right now, we don't necessarily know what that interpreter's skill is until we have another individual who's deaf who can tell us. right?
Let me just interrupt you and ask you about that assessment. Where and how is that done, or is it done? Where does the student go to take that assessment?
Yeah, that is a national assessment, but we do have places here in Tennessee. I believe at each of the centers. April, do you have the locations where that can happen?
Yes, for national, the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf certification, there's a site in Knoxville. And there are also several other ones, but for the educational interpreters proficiency,
Then Tina would be able to answer that part.
There's actually two national certifications.
Okay.
There's EIPA, that's Educational Interpreters Proficiency Assessment, and then there's the National Interpreter Certification Exam. So there's two different national exams.
So the one national exam is with the first caveat up there, the bachelor's degree, and that's at UTK. Then the EIPA, which is the other one, Tina will be able to tell us where they can take that.
The Tennessee School for the Deaf.
Okay. Okay. And there is where they actually are signing as well as a written portion, which I think we know through some of our bilingual educators, it's very different in print and in sign. And so it's important to have both of those pieces. All right. Now we realize that not every interpreter that we have in schools is going to necessarily meet one of those two choices, and yet they're high quality. And we don't want to put them out of a job through this policy change. And so we've accounted for that we will have individuals who maybe aren't then in the school services personnel. So they won't be paid teacher pay, but hopefully their district will recognize that they are high quality through showing that they have passed the written portion of that EIPA, that proficiency exam, and in this case, passed also the demonstration port, the actual conversation piece with a 3.0. That they would have until January 1st of 2021. So we would give them 5 years to do that. So that's a pretty substantial amount of time. That also gives them the option that if they get test anxiety, like so many of us do, they have a second or third chance to get through that, because we know that test anxiety doesn't necessarily indicate their true abilities. The expectations for our districts then would be that they would recognize those certified educational interpreters in that school service personnel, but also if they are hiring, that they're going to give that good faith attempt to hire high quality certified educational interpreters. Now, we don't want any student without services, and we know that they're not always available, right? So we did have a caveat for that as well, that they would have a letter of support from their district, a minimum of an associate's degree, and pass the written portion. And so again, kind of showing that non-licensed. We want to see districts giving a good faith effort, a good faith attempt. We realize that's not always possible, so we do have that avenue through the district letter of support. And for compensation, that would very much change the salary. Again, we might get above poverty rate, right, for some of our interpreters, because they would be in the school services personnel. They would be paid as though they are teachers in that according pay scale.
There are some changes that would argue the
Well, there is that, but you know, it's certainly more fair than 14,000, I would think, right? And then hopefully, since we now have a way to say that our educational interpreters have a certain level of qualification through this policy, even those that are not certified, the district will now have a way to say, yes, you're going to get paid a little higher than that 14,000 because you do have these skills, and I know you have these skills because of this EIPA assessment. So even those non-certified, we're hoping those districts will continue to recognize that accomplishment as well, and the importance of an educational interpreter. And this is our contact. Questions?
Now, will doing this increase the BEP funding of the system? It won't, will it?
Well, actually, through the IEP, through the service page, like for occupational therapy or for speech therapy, they will be able to identify through the service page that they have an educational interpreter assigned to that student, which will draw some fundings.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, ma'am.
Just give us a number, approximate number of the students that you've been benefiting.
I thought you might ask that question. So in Tennessee, as of December 1, 2015, age 6 to 21, we have 16 students who have deaf blindness. And then we have roughly 1,216 students who have hearing impairments. But also, within our multiple disabilities category, we have students also who may have a secondary disability that would be a hearing impairment.
And also, what about the students who may not be hearing impaired, but their parents would need an interpreter when they come to school for meetings? Would that, it would impact those interpreters that come from parents who need to communicate with the school?
Right. Well, our hope would be that districts would engage with educational interpreters for those meetings because of the language and the work we do in the school settings. Right now, LEAs contract with centers across the state to come in, similar to what we do as a state agency if that need arises. But that would be certainly something we would recommend. So.
Do you have a breakdown by region? East, west, middle?
Of student counts, I don't have it with me, but I can get that to you. I can give Sarah to share with the board.
Okay.
So, yes, we can do it by the 8 core regions or by grand divisions, either one.
Grand division.
Okay, great.
Wendy?
I have to ask questions or you think I'm sleeping.
Right.
So,
I haven't been tempted to think
I
that.
didn't think you would. See, I'm doing my job. So the numbers, first of all, thank you and thank all of you for this very important work. You mentioned the numbers of students. Can you give us an idea of the shortage numbers? I mean, are there kids with IEPs that are calling for interpreters that aren't able to get them?
I know of a particular situation in a First Tennessee County where we ended up, the school district ended up contracting with someone from North Carolina because there was no one available in that region of the state. Tina actually, through outreach, deals with some of that. Tina, would you like to share anything there? Or
Sure.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm Tina Bajak with the Tennessee School for the Deaf, and I've seen a lot of different school systems. The shortage is in the rural areas. In Knoxville, because we have the 2 training programs, we have the School for the Deaf, we have a lot of interpreters. Nashville has a lot of interpreters, Memphis. But if you go out to Portland, or Counce, or Bon Aqua, People Landing, there's just not, that there aren't people there. And because the pay is so low, somebody from Knoxville is not going to move to a town to earn $14,000 a year and start your family there. And so there is a shortage. And we end up having unqualified interpreters working because they find somebody in that rural area who has a good heart and they try to teach themselves and learn because they want to help the child, but their skills are not where they need to be.
Okay. And I mean, the shortage, I think, is one concern. I mean, another concern is, not the big concern, is the pay and the quality. So my lawyer brain heard good faith attempts and immediately wondered how on earth you were going to police that. I mean, if I'm a district that doesn't want to pay this extra money because I'm struggling to make ends meet, and I can just say, oops, we tried. I mean, what are good faith attempts going to look like?
Right. Well, part of that, I think, would be similar to what occurs with waiver applications for teacher licensing, that they would have to show they advertised and went through the effort of attempting to find a qualified educational interpreter. Because of, I mean, we have 2 quality programs in the state at UT Knoxville and Maryville College. We have in the past, like with our visual impairment programs, also our speech language pathologist programs, used some of our IDEA discretionary dollars to start programs to grow teacher candidates. And we've committed to do that with our educational interpreter task force too, to establish discretionary grant opportunities to recruit, hopefully in each grand division, so we can increase the quality applicants. So.
And then my final question
Of the day?
No. This 5-year timeline. Here earlier when I was complaining about lag times, I mean, is it necessary for 5 years to give districts?
Based on where we are with the
turnaround,
yes, the individuals that are in the field, yes, just the numbers are. We have a need there.
and the logistics of testing every current educational interpreter becomes a difficulty as well.
I just think the 6-year-old is going to be 11 now.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the task force put a lot of thought into their recommendations. So
I don't know what happened.
Did I do that?
I don't know.
I've been known to end many a show, so.
I don't know what any of these do, but.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
No, thank you so much.
Good job, we appreciate it. Philip, you're on.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know that in the interest of time, I would like to suggest if we want to, let me know which teachers we would really like to pull out and discuss more fully. We can do that tomorrow in the meeting as well, because I would like to take some time and give Peter Abernathy from TSAC a moment to go over the student loan process, since I know there were questions about that and the default process from October.
Okay, Wendy?
I would just say, I'm happy to, I think we probably should talk about them in the meeting, but if you wanna know which ones I'm gonna ask to pull off the agenda, I can tell you that now. I don't know if you want that now or later, or if Philip may want it,
Now would be great. We can always take some questions today if you want to, or we can put it off till tomorrow. I'm fine with that too.
I think tomorrow's probably the perfect time to talk about these, unless you wanna talk about them today. I'm gonna be asking to pull B, D, and J.
B, D, and J?
Yes.
Okay.
Harwood, Montgomery, and Wade.
And if anyone has anyone to add to that list, I'd be happy to do that as well. Okay.
Are the others, now, when you say pull them off, you say treat them separate, not as a group, that would.
Correct, yes, sir.
Not on consent.
What's that?
I don't know if we do these on consent.
Well, we don't, but, we'll do the rest of them. We'll pull B, C, B, D, and J, handle individually, we'll address the others as a group.
I'll have motions on those two.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, and I had asked you a question at the phone call.
Yes.
About the formal reprimand.
Yes. And I can address that right now if you like, or I can address it tomorrow, either way. Okay, well, I've gone ahead and circled it to make sure that I have everything put together in a good, clear, concise manner for you. And I think preferably do that tomorrow so we can address all of the teachers at once. Peter, if you'd like to come up and...
Okay, now this is on the Tennessee Student Assistance.
Correct, yes. Our other suspension set.
Yep.
I also want to thank you for coming, especially on last minute invitation, because as the board may remember in October, this was a point of real discussion, and our chairman flagged it recently for me to discuss today, and I'm considering making yourself available for the last minute invitation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Peter Abernathy. I'm with the Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation, and Dr. Haburn asked me to come and explain the due diligence that goes into our work with students, student borrowers who go into default. And so I can go through this fairly quickly. It's actually a fairly long process, but I can summarize it, I think, fairly quickly. By way of background, in 1999 there was a statute that was put on the books here in Tennessee that required TSAC to work with the Department of Health and the Division of Regulatory Boards within the Department of Commerce and Insurance to notify them of professional license holders who were in default on a student loan. For whatever reason, this was before my time, but for whatever reason, TSAC did not do anything with that program. It wasn't until about 2008 that an audit, state audit, told us that we needed to implement something to comply with that statute. So that's when we started the program and started working with the Department of Health and basically one half of Commerce and Insurance. That program went forward, and in 2012, the statutes were expanded to include all professional licenses in the state. So attorneys, teachers, lobbyists, sports agents, the other half of commerce and insurance, virtually everyone who holds a professional license in the state. So that was passed in 2012. Roughly mid-2013 is when we began to implement that then with the various boards after we got the programming accomplished. So that's when we started working with the State Board of Education on this. In terms of the due diligence that goes into working with these student borrowers, this is basically what happens. A student will take out a federal student loan, and both at the time of entering school and taking out the loan and leaving school, they have an entrance and an exit conference with the financial aid office, where a financial aid officer sits down with the student, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups, and explains to them all of the processes, all of the requirements, all of the details of their student loan, their federal student loan. They tell them what is required, they tell them about default, they tell them what's available to them if they have trouble making payments, and so on. So that's kind of the first step. Another more subtle step is that on the master promissory note itself, it describes what a default is and the consequences of default. And it states, and this is a U.S. Department of Education form, it states that based on the state that you live in, that suspension of a professional license may be at risk if you go into default. So I can't tell you how many students actually read their promissory note, probably not many, but at least it's there in writing for them to have at the time that they do sign it. So when they finish school, they get out, they have basically a 60-day grace period before payments begin. They start making payments. When they miss a payment and go for 60 days without a payment, so essentially they're missing 2 payments, they go into a period of delinquency. The lender is required to send them a letter notifying them that they're delinquent and outlining for them the steps that are necessary to come back into payment, what options are available to them if they are having trouble with their payments. They let them know what a default is, how that works, and what the consequences are of a default. So that letter goes out after 60 days. The options that are available to them are important to understand because really during this period of delinquency, the Department of Education is very lenient, very generous with students who are having trouble with payments. There are currently 4 different income-based repayment plans. They all work essentially the same. The idea is to cap the monthly payment, so most of them, it's a 10% cap on their monthly discretionary income. So these various income-based repayment plans are available. And then there's deferment and forbearance, which are 2 other programs that work essentially the same. And the idea is to delay payments for some period of time based on illness, financial hardship, unemployment, inability to find employment, continuing enrollment in a post-secondary institution. There are various graduate and medical programs that will qualify. The list is quite extensive that if the student meets those various circumstances, they may be eligible then for deferment or forbearance. So all of this is listed in this communication that they get from the lender. If the delinquency period goes on from there, the lender reaches out to the guarantee agency, so in this case TSAC, and to the school where the student attended. The schools have a vested interest in this process because the school's overall default rate measured by the students who attend there, if it hits certain triggers, can restrict receipt of federal financial aid. So the schools have a very strong interest in making sure their default rates are kept low. So you have the lender, the guarantee agency, and the school all reaching out to the student. And the lender, by law, is required to send over a 270-day period, which is the period of delinquency. They're required to send 6 notices or make 6 attempts at contacting the borrower. spaced over no more than a 45-day gap between each one. So this 270-day period is hit with 6 different notices. And then you also have the school and the guarantee agency making attempts to contact the borrower. Keep in mind, too, the promissory note states that the borrower has the responsibility to notify the lender of any change of address. If they cross 270 days with no payment, that's when it kicks into default. At that point, the lender has, I think, up to 180 days to sell the loan to a guarantee agency. The guarantee agency then takes the loan and services it as our own. We will send a letter automatically to the student at the beginning, letting them know the loan has been sold, that we're the servicer, who the payments are to go to, that they're in default, what the consequences are, and how to come out of it. After those first 60 days that we've made those attempts at contact, we'll then solicit the help of collection agencies. One of the tools that we have then to use, of course, is this license review program. And the way this program works is this: we will send a letter through certified mail to the borrower, and we're basically copying the language from the statute in this letter, and it tells them they have 90 days to either set up a payment plan or completely pay off the student loan, or they have 20 days to request a due process hearing. So if they don't contact us within that 90-day period, we're then required by the statute to notify the licensing board of the default status and to request an action against the license. So between the 270 days of delinquency, the 60 days with us minimum before we start the 90-day letter, you're looking at 420 days minimum before any action is taken against the license. The whole time this is going on, there are attempts at phone calls, emails, letters. We do skip tracing. We look at the Tennessee State Driver's License database. We do everything we can to find, locate these borrowers and let them know what we can do to help. If the license is suspended, what's required then is simply to enter into a payment plan. Once they make their first payment, the suspension is lifted. To give you just some, well, let me state too that one thing that goes unnoticed, I think a lot of times, is how this can help these borrowers, because once they go into default, of course, there's a mark on their credit report that shows the default, which restricts them from any other financial aid, state or federal, if they want to go back to school for any reason. Of course, if they want to buy a car or get a home loan or whatever, that's either restricted or much more expensive with that default on their credit. So the federal government has a rehabilitation program, so if they make 9 monthly payments in a 10-month period, they're eligible for this rehab. What we do is we then package those loans, we sell them to a secondary lender who services the loan as though it's new. The default is taken off of the credit, fixes their credit report, and puts them back in good standing. And roughly half of all of our borrowers go through that and have that benefit as they make payments. I looked yesterday at the statistics. There have been, since 2013, 1,505 teachers who've had that letter sent to them, certified mail. Of that 1,500, 845 have been suspended at least one time. And of that 845, as of yesterday, 252 remained in suspension. So the difference have come out of suspension. Now that 252, a lot of those are currently in payment, in some kind of payment plan, will come out of suspension, but at least as of yesterday, that point in time, there were those that were still in suspension. So it's, I don't know how many teachers there are in the state, but a lot more than 250. But so those are the numbers we're talking about. The other statistic that's probably good to know is that you know, what you hear about on the news or what you may hear with phone calls, complaints from teachers are the extreme cases. The average student loan that we have in this licensing program, and this average is for all of our license types with all the licensing boards, is roughly $15,000. I don't know what the teacher's average would be, but it would be fairly close to that. So we're not talking about extreme amounts of loan amounts that are due. It's when they go for years without making payments that you have the interest and the penalties and the collection costs that are added into it, that you can see the balance just go sky high. So if they get into payments and start on the payment plan and keep to that, then typically it's a pretty reasonable amount.
Wendy, you were concerned about some of the processes, how long it took in education. I think you just found winter takes longer.
Actually, that was going through my head. That is some amazing lag time.
That is amazing, how much effort you know, that is amazing. I think it's amazing.
Well, the worst thing that a borrower can do is when they get into trouble to just, you know, crawl under a rock somewhere and hide and don't talk to anybody. If they'll reach out, if they'll answer our phone calls or the lender's phone calls, they can get the help they need. It's when they just go into denial that the problems begin.
The more the question, I think the background is good to have, and I'm amazed at the process that you got here. Because in some way that, what action do we have to take here, or what action is required that we take, and do we need to do it each meeting and so forth? It becomes, you know, such a routine thing that it kind of seems arbitrary whether it is an easy way to get done what needs to get done.
Well, our statute, in the statute we work under requires us to mirror the suspension. Once they notify us of the default, we then, by our rules, notify the teacher, again, with another opportunity for a hearing. And failing requesting a hearing, then the action, our proposed action of suspension stands after that. As far as if we need to take an immediate vote each time, I believe our rules state that we need to take a vote to suspend licenses. It does not, however, state explicitly that we need to vote on every particular name if there's a vote to take an action based on certain notifications and relying on the due process that's been afforded there, then I believe that the vote could cover upcoming and future actions as well.
Okay, I'm not sure I.
Well, and again, I know Elizabeth and Nathan worked on this. One of the things we wanted to try to discuss, and I know we're way over time, and it's helpful to have Peter kind of walk through, because he did that for us when I came on board initially, just so that I could understand better. You know, we did have concerns about whether this was sort of a matter of punishment and crime fitting, and what agency do we have as a board. You know, things are in statute that put us in place in voting on these loan defaults. You can hear all this sort of chances, but Nathan, Elizabeth, I mean, you all have been working on potentially something that will allow us to take more blanket action, or for you all as a board to take more blanket action, so that if it is a perfunctory vote based on the statute, we could sort of approach it that way.
So we've got some language that we've put together between your very able legal staff and just trying to figure out the exact way parliamentarily to do it. And so, Mr. Chairman, you will have in your hands tomorrow morning kind of a script that walks through the specific laws and what we're required to do. And prepared for you, if you'd like to make a motion to suspend all of them that come to notice within the calendar year. And on advice from our attorneys, we think that would be defensible to do every January. Specifically with the TSAC defaults, because they go through so many different opportunities to have their due process and their public hearing. And recognizing that even with the one vote that you take, they could still ask for a hearing and they would get a hearing from us as well. So we think we've figured out a way to thread that needle.
Okay, good. How long is the script?
It's It's actually, you're gonna read a paragraph about one of the statutes, a paragraph about the other one, and then you'll spell it out.
The whole thing's maybe 8 sentences.
Mr. Chairman, do not run it by Wendy.
Brevity.
Okay, other,
I just wanted to ask, Mr. Abernathy, do you know which of these people are still working as teachers, or if some of them have left the profession?
The ones, the ones who've been suspended and not had the suspension lifted, we don't. I think what we can do is probably, well, no. The short answer is no, we don't. Yeah.
I think that's one of the questions that's always kind of hurt us to vote on this, because we felt like we were voting to pull a license for a teacher who was in one of our classrooms.
Mhm.
And that's really a hard thing.
Yeah, and I know that happens, but a lot of these people, you know, they, regardless of the type of license, they move around a lot. They're very transient. They go from job to job. They don't have a permanent address. They're hard to get a hold of, and we've just seen that throughout the entire system of licenses that we deal with. Yeah.
Thank you.
you know, the numbers are, I guess, interesting, you know, the 845 that we have suspended, there's only 252 of those that remain suspended. I was kind of making the assumption that these people all gotten to the point where they didn't care whether we suspended it or not, or they would have responded to some of the processes we used. Evidently, some of them are.
Well, and over the past few months as I've been working with you, I update the suspension list weekly until the meeting, and the number of people that drop off each time is fairly high.
That's a great failure. Yeah. Okay, appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Any other questions on any other agenda items? We have Warden Wendy out. Any other questions? Okay, do appreciate all the presentations. Everybody here, I think it's been a long day, very productive day, and certainly appreciate your staying with us. Also not taking a break at 2 o'clock. So.